talk. This is about us trying to answer the question, how can the university better recognise and reward open research practices? So this talk's being given by myself. I'm Robert Darby, the university's research data manager. So I have been involved in work in the university to develop open research culture and also work to improve our research assessment practices. I'm delivering this session with my colleague Miranda, who is the university's research culture manager. So Miranda was involved with me in organising and delivering a workshop, which we're going to talk about today. So this is a brief outline of today's session. So I'm going to talk first of all about some discussions that have been going on in the higher education sector over the last few years about rewarding open research. And I'm going to talk about how this has informed some strategic activity at the university on that theme. Miranda's then going to discuss a workshop that a number of university stakeholders were recently involved in, which was about discussing how this university can better recognise and reward open research. So I think this talk should probably take us about half an hour or so. We'd very much be interested then in opening up the session for discussion. So we want to hear perspectives from the research community. The university is currently developing policy for research assessment. So we're interested in hearing views on how members of the research community feel open research should be recognised within research assessment and researcher assessment practices. Okay, so that's the outline for the session today. So I'm going to start now by spending a bit of time summarising discussions in the sector around this question on this slide. So why should we recognise and reward open research? So let's be clear to start with what we mean by research assessment. So this is something that happens at different levels. So we have, for example, the REF, our national research assessment exercise, which assesses institutions to determine how much government funding a university receives. But we also have assessment of researchers and of their record as individuals. And that might be assessment, for example, by funders to determine who they award grant funding to, or it might be assessment by institutions as part of internal processes, things like recruitment and promotion, academic probation, performance review. All of those activities, they define requirements and criteria that institutions and individuals need to meet in order to receive some benefit or some reward. And we're particularly interested here in that third category of assessment on this slide. So that's assessment of researchers by institutions. So there have been concerns in the sector for some years that research assessment policies and practices may not be optimal. So those concerns focused especially initially on the problematic use of quantitative indicators related to publications as proxies for quality. A lot of the talk was about use of the journal impact factor and the H-index in particular as problematic quantitative metrics. But other themes have also come to be defined over the years as the discussions have evolved in the sector, particularly around how research assessment shapes research culture and how many of the activities involved in research are often overlooked within research assessment because of a narrow focus on publications and publication record. We know that researchers can engage in a wide variety of activities that contribute to research outcomes, and they can generate a wide range of outputs other than publications, data sets, software, digital resources, peer reviews, exhibitions, performances, and so on. But those outputs and activities, they often lack visibility within research assessment frameworks. So if we look at the REF, for example, in 2021, there were over 185,000 outputs submitted in 21 different output categories. More than 97% of those outputs fell into the main academic publication categories, A to E, which are authored and edited books, book chapters, journal articles and conference contributions. Over 83% of the total were journal articles. If you look right over at the right of this chart, you can see that the number of research data sets and databases submitted was 31, and the number of software outputs was 11. So the takeaway message is that it's all about the publications. What gets rewarded, what's the object in institutional planning and individual target setting, is the production of publications. Other types of research output, they barely register in the systems of research planning and assessment. And that influences what risen sector for many years. It was first highlighted probably in the first major intervention that highlighted it was the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, as it's widely known. That was published in 2013. So DORA is mainly associated with the recommendations it makes around the appropriate use of publication metrics in research assessment. It's perhaps less well remembered for this other recommendation which it makes to institutions, which is, for purposes of research assessment, consider the value and impact of all research outputs, including datasets and software, etc., in addition to publications. A number of other discussions in the area of research assessment have also developed this theme with a specific emphasis on open research. For example, the Hong Kong Principles for Assessing Researchers, which were published in 2020, a call for research assessment to acknowledge a wider range of research and related activities, including open research practice. And the authors there, they make a strong link between open research and research transparency and integrity. And the agreement on reforming research assessment, which this university signed in 2023, that also provides very strong direction on the need to recognize open research. This agreement also, it references, as you can see on the slide there, the UNESCO recommendation on open science. So that is an internationally recognized recommendation. It was agreed by all UNESCO member states and adopted in 2021. And that says, among other things, that assessment of scientific contribution and career progression rewarding good open science practices is needed for operationalization of open science. Which is quite a mouthful, but I think you get what it's saying. Open science here means science in the European sense of knowledge. So it's not just the practices of the natural sciences that are being discussed here, but across all domains of knowledge. So you can see that there's a body of thought which has developed, articulating basically a theory of change. So it assumes that by modifying the systems that produce and evaluate and reward research, we can influence the behavior of researchers. So they will be incentivized to build a track record of open research practice. That can be demonstrated when they go through assessment processes, for example, when they apply for a job or when they go for promotion. And that in turn will generate benefits for the institution as a whole, because open research practices support research transparency, they support good quality research and its capacity to generate impact by making its outputs accessible to others. So that's why the university takes this position that integrating recognition and reward for open research into research assessment practice is essential to the growth of open research culture. And that was identified as an objective for the university in our first Open Research Action Plan. That's basically a strategic plan that the university has developed to foster the growth of open research culture within the university, if you're not familiar with that. And it's also being addressed by the university's Research Assessment Working Group, which is currently working to develop a research assessment policy for the university. So that's the group that's actually taking forward this objective stated in the Open Research Action Plan. And one of the principles in the draft policy that's been developed and is currently being co-developed with various stakeholders in the university is that assessment should recognize openness and reproducibility in research. So that's defined as one of the key principles of the research assessment policy as it currently exists in draft. So this leads us into discussion of the workshop that we organised, and I think at this point I'm handing over to Miranda, who's going to tell you what happened in that workshop and what came out of it.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, so I've got control of the slides now, and my cat has chosen this exact moment to jump onto my desk after not jumping on the desk while you were talking. So don't be too distracted if he walks across the screen. So I'm here to talk about a workshop that we recently ran looking at recognition and reward of open research. And this was organised by the Open Research Action Plan Implementation Group here at Reading and the Research Assessment Working Group here at Reading. So the workshop that we recently delivered was run as part of a project on open and responsible researcher reward and recognition, which is referred to as OR4 for short. And that's a sort of national project that Reading's been in, which is part of a broader open research programme, which is a national initiative being supported by Research England and led by the UK Reproducibility Network. So part of this OR4 project has included the development of a toolkit, which we used as part of delivering the workshop that we ran. So on the screen here, I have an image of part of the maturity framework that was developed as part of the OR4 toolkit. And as you can see, there's sort of 4 sections in the framework, from no action to emerging to evolving to sustained, which outline the different levels of maturity that each section of the framework can be rated on. So the image here just shows one section of the framework. There's 3 in total, and this is around strategy and leadership. And so for each action area, there's a description of what sort of no action would look like in this area, all the way up to what sustained action in this area looks like. So we use that tool as part of our workshop. So the workshop that we ran was in April of this year, a couple of months ago, and there were 15 stakeholders involved in total. So most of the participants were themselves members of Reading's Research Assessment Working Group or the Open Research Action Plan Implementation Group, but there are also several members of our wider academic community here at Reading to ensure that we did have some perspectives coming from outside of those groups to sort of get thinking that sort of wasn't informed by sort of knowledge that you would only have from being in those 2 groups. So the aims of this workshop was to develop a shared understanding of why at the University of Reading we should be recognising and rewarding open research, to where we are currently in terms of our maturity level against the framework in the various aspects of this work, and where we want to be in the next 3 years, as well as then starting to outline a roadmap for how we get to where we want to be in 3 years' time. So there were sort of 3 stages to this. So prior to the workshop taking place, all participants were asked to spend no more than a couple of hours doing some preliminary reading using the guidance provided in the OR4 toolkit and completing individually a self-assessment where they filled in where they thought Reading was in its maturity level for each of the action areas in the framework. During the workshop itself, which lasted a couple of hours, the participants were presented with a brief summary of the findings from across their individual self-assessments. And then we had a series of breakout groups looking at key successes, challenges, where we want to be in 3 years' time, and key actions needed to achieve that change. Following the workshop, the findings are written up into a report, including key recommendations that will be being discussed with the key working groups involved. So the first section of the maturity framework focuses around strategy and leadership. So do we have the good strategy and leadership in place to enable reward and recognition of open research practices. So this consisted of 3 action areas: institutional commitment, leadership, and strategy and planning. So the image on the screen, we have 3 circles, and those circles represent the average score from across the self-assessments that we received from the workshop participants. So this section of the framework was overall perceived to be Reading's strongest area, with all 3 areas averaging somewhere between emerging and evolving, according to the views of the participants. Leadership at Reading around reward and recognition of open research was seen as the strongest average area in the framework as a whole, averaging 2.6 and being slightly closer towards evolving on the whole. In discussing sort of where we want to be in 3 years' time, the breakout group within the workshop looking at this area felt that for all of these areas we should have certainly progressed to evolving and be, in their words, moving on to evolving plus, so getting towards sustained but not quite there in the next 3 years. So on the screen there I've just added 3 circles showing where I want to be in 3 years' time. So just to pull out the sort of key comments that were coming up through people's self-assessments in this area. Around institutional commitment, participants felt that at Reading we have a good level of commitment to the principles of rewarding and recognising open research practices, but that this wasn't yet embedded into the things that we're doing. So people pointed towards the existence of our public statements and stances, the funding and sponsorship of activities, and the existence of things like a committee on open research and research integrity. For leadership, so this was the strongest overall area on the framework for Reading, and this was largely due to a sense that there was a senior level buy-in for this work, but that further work was needed to engage sort of more local leadership. So people spoke about examples of senior staff in the university leading and sponsoring work, Reading's involvement in things like this project, OR4, but still having quite limited engagement from sort of local managers and research division leads. And then around strategy and planning, as Robert slightly touched on, we have an open research action plan, which is now in its 2nd edition. We've recently shared a action plan for the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment. And so this section of the framework, people largely talked about actions within those action plans and progress we've made towards sort of fulfilling some of those actions. And then from the discussions around what we'd need to get towards that evolving plus category, there were sort of a few overall recommendations. So participants felt that it would be good to sort of focus in on developing open research awareness and buy-in of local leaders and managers. To look at whether there might be options for more explicitly including open research related responsibilities or accountabilities within key role descriptions, and to see when looking at policy implementation and working with process owners and stakeholders, how we can really enable recognition and reward for open research. So then the second section of the maturity framework focuses all around implementation. So the practicalities of when we're looking at rewarding and recognizing open research, where we are around our communications and engagement, our policies and procedures, our support systems and processes, and our guidance and training. So in this section, on the whole, most people's scores averaged around the emerging area, except for the guidance and training section. So from the perspective of the participants, that was perceived as one of the weakest areas in the maturity framework overall, averaging sort of halfway between no action and emerging, depending on whether people were aware of any actions in this area. And then when discussing where this should be in 3 years' time, there was a sense that all of these should have moved up, but in particular, there was a sort of very ambitious view around wanting communications and engagement to get all the way up to sustained to really invest in that area. And then the other areas to sort of be moving at a more sort of gradual level, but still making that progress towards being evolving. So again, some key points around this. There was an overall sense that communications are sort of failing to reach and engage our wider university or change people's behaviours in practice. Quite a few of the participants used the word patchy to describe what our communications and engagement were like in this area. Although it was noted that the time we had ongoing co-development of the new research assessment policy, and that was an example of, sort of good communication and engagement of engaging people from our research community in that work. Around policy and procedure, it's felt that in terms of recognizing and rewarding open research, there wasn't very much provision around this at the moment. A few examples were noted, but it was anticipated that with the new research assessment policy that's being developed, this area would be improving over time. Again, with systems and processes, people again noted about this new policy being implemented and some existing support available, in particular from the sort of research engagement team in the library. But people also noted that there were sort of limitations with the current systems we have, and also that many staff were not very aware of what systems and processes were already in place. And then for guidance and training, people did refer to some examples of existing guidance, but there was a sense that this wasn't always being followed. And then existing open research training more broadly, but has low uptake and isn't specifically focused on rewarding and recognizing open research. So around recommendations in this area, there's generally a sense that our existing communications activities would need to be reviewed to see how we could sort of strengthen our communications and engagement plan for this work. And that when communicating about the new research assessment policy being developed, that it would be good to highlight examples of specifically recognizing and rewarding open research. There'd be a need to develop and provide guidance and training on presenting and assessing open research and ensure that this was included within the research assessment policy guidance and training. And as part of that guidance being developed, to ensure that there is some acknowledgement of the sort of practicalities of how you actually go about assessing open research. There was also discussion about differences across disciplines, that what open research practices look like in the different contact disciplines needed to be acknowledged. And so it was felt that guidance and training around open research within the new research assessment policy, it would be helpful to include examples taken from different disciplines and different types of research. There's also acknowledgement that workload implications would pose a challenge to implementation and changing behaviours. And so there was a suggestion that we could see how this interacts with things like ongoing work around looking at workload allocation models for academics. So finally, there's one last section of the maturity framework, and that's around managing progress. So this area looks at monitoring and evaluation and research planning in relation to recognizing and rewarding open research. So this one did receive the lowest sort of overall perceptions compared to the other sections of the framework. Monitoring and evaluation in particular sort of had the lowest average score at sort of 1.4, so being slightly closer towards no action rather than emerging. Again, participants felt that we could make improvements on both of these areas within the next 3 years, and we're hopeful that both of these would be sort of in the emerging section, but making good progress towards evolving in 3 years' time. So for monitoring and evaluation, the general view was that we did need more action in this area, although there are some limitations because of existing mechanisms and resources. There was some mention of some analysis that had been looked at in 2022, which had found that there was no evidence of open research criteria being used in personal title submissions and academic post applications. But since that piece of work, there hadn't been other activity in this area. And then for research planning, again, this was described as sort of inconsistent or patchy or sporadic, and depended a lot on sort of individuals. So it was sometimes, so open research was sometimes thought about within individual and research division planning, but not always, despite efforts to incorporate this into research division operational plans and academic research planning processes. So lastly, in this area, recommendations that sort of came up were around looking at how we can engage senior leaders and key stakeholders in thinking about how research planning processes could more effectively enable the adoption of open research practices, how we could use narrative CV models to support the presenting and assessment of open research practices, and to ensure that open research is considered and addressed as part of developing monitoring and evaluation of the new research assessment policy. So that is where things currently are. Those recommendations are still to be discussed and incorporated into our existing action plans. So we have a few questions for discussion. It's quite a small group of us today, but we can see if you have any thoughts, that'd be great to hear. So we have a few questions here to sort of help with sharing your thoughts. So firstly, do you think that the university should recognise and reward open research? Are you aware of any of open research being recognised, awarded in your school, department, or research division, as it's helpful for us to hear about sort of local activity going on? How might increasing recognition and reward of open research affect you as a researcher? Would it have a change on the way you work? And how might you present sort of open research activities and outputs if you're doing something like applying for a job or a promotion?